I'd like to welcome everyone tonight. Everybody can hear me okay? Yep. So this is our third annual Juneteenth event, which is pretty interesting. Over the past couple of years, we've had different guest speakers, and I think the program is getting more and more interesting, and the most important part of it is that we're narrowing down to really precise aspects of our local history. And so instead of doing general history, which you would learn about in school, these topics are much more pinpointed towards our local history. The Historical Society, the Hockessin Historical Society, is actually doing a few interesting programs more recently. One is we're working on the Shirley Bula historic marker. How many of you have heard of Shirley Bula? Show of hands. A few of you. How many of you have heard of Brown versus Board of Education? Okay, there you go. So the historic marker is for Shirley Bula and the Brown versus Board of Education. And that is one of the most interesting topics in Hockessin. It happened right on Limestone Road, which is Route 7, and Valley Road, which is about a mile away from here. And the interesting aspect of it was that Shirley's mother wanted her to be able to ride the white school bus to her black school, 107C. And because of that, an entire case ensued, and that became part of Brown versus Board of Education, and it ended school segregation in Delaware. And this was in 1950. So if you think about that, that's basically our modern history. So we're going back to 1850s or so with these programs. And one program that we're working on also is the National Park Service has a program called the Network to Freedom. And I looked at the map, and there were sites down in Wilmington that are listed on the Network to Freedom. There's sites up in Kennett Square that are listed, and then they kind of bypassed all of Hockessin. And what we've done is we've included the Hockessin area now. So we have one site that's already approved as of last year. We have a second site that's going to be approved this July, I believe. And then we're working on 2 more sites that are in this area. So, and it's a lot easier of a program than getting listed on the Historic Register. So the National Historic Register is much harder to get approved on, but the Network to Freedom is still, it requires a large amount of work and many hours and a large application that needs to be filled out. And then they have to go through all the work to approve it. So we're really proud to be able to have that other part of our history being saved and preserved for future generations. So, and it's the documentation of that that really does a great part to save that history. And even if there are places that aren't located here anymore, if the houses aren't here, if there's still that history, those sites can be still listed. So that's a really great thing. So I think that's really all I wanted to say. I wanted to thank Newcastle County for the grant. This is a Newcastle County grant that allows us to have this educational event for all of you. So that's a really awesome thing that we get funding for. And Matt Meyer, I think, is supposed to be here. He usually gives us a proclamation and asks the audience a few questions. So if he shows up, that would be great. If not, though, we still have the support of all of our local county council members and elected officials. So it's really great to have them helping us out. So I think that's all I want to say. Last year, I spoke for way too long, and Darlene told me not to speak for very long this year. But I do want to thank a few other people, all of our volunteer members. So Darlene Moby puts in hundreds of hours into programs like this. She really is a great volunteer for the community. And we have a new volunteer, Gage, who is, his only job right now for today is to monitor the camcorder. But he is one of the few people that sends me emails that says, that say, how can I help your organization? I want to volunteer, and how can I help? So when people say that, that's like the best email I could get. Because usually people are asking me for information and complaining to me. So when I get somebody that's actually asking what they can do to help, it's really an awesome thing. So it's people like him who are giving back to the community the best they can, and then you can put that kind of thing on your resume, for work and get credit for it also. So he gets a little something out of it besides having to sit behind the camcorder.
A little something.
So I think we're ready to get started. Who's speaking next?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Juneteenth. We have two people here. They are both members of our group, Hockessin Juneteenth. One is in the second, going into the second grade, he's 7. The other one is going into the 4th grade, and he's 9. They're going to read us a little bit of something about Juneteenth, okay? So I'm going to ask Tosh and Kevin to go up on the stage.
Juneteenth is an African-American celebration of the ending of slavery, held every year on June 19th. Juneteenth celebrates the day in 1865 when the Union Army entered Texas in order that all slaves be free.
Thank you, boys. Thank you. Try not to push it.
I got it.
We're going to go ahead and present our first speaker. And I was very happy when Milt Diggins agreed to come and speak, because I've heard him speak many times before, and he's always been very good. He will be speaking today. And where is Milt? Oh, here he is, right here. Milt, go ahead.
It's warming up again. It had been on.
Can we have some help with the
It started. I need to start
I guess
as well.
we got it
There are
all.
going to be some areas that I usually give a little more detail, but I'm going to kind of summarize a little bit more. All right, stealing freedom along the Mason-Dixon line. Thomas McCreary, the notorious slave catcher, kidnapper from Maryland. Now, when you look at the corridor between,
Speak in the mic.
when you look at the corridor between Philadelphia and Baltimore, and Cecil County and of course Newcastle County are right dead center in that corridor. Now, this was a rather hot spot for the issue of slavery, and for good reason. You have Philadelphia as the center for abolitionist activity and assistance for fugitives. A number of fugitives would head to Philadelphia for help. Wilmington, Thomas Garrett, and other active Underground Railroad operatives assisted runaways on their way to Philadelphia and directed them usually to Philadelphia. And Baltimore was a major city for slave trade. And then, of course, course, our midpoint, Cecil, I live in Cecil, but of course Newcastle was also part of that midpoint.
So that we could hear him.
Now, here's the problem, and I'm just there. When you look at the corridor, you have abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates, slaveholders and pro-slavery advocates, freedom seekers, slave catchers, informers, kidnappers, kidnap victims, free blacks, self-defense leagues, the enslaved, slave dealers, and regular citizens who got pulled into these events whether they wanted to or not. So it was an very explosive mix. Now, first incident where McCreary, that I came across McCreary was involved in was a kidnapping, or was an incident, I should say, in Downingtown in 1848. In this building, and some of you may recognize it if you're familiar with Downingtown, this was the public library until recently. This is the home of Zebulon Thomas, an Underground Railroad agent. He had two servants who were working for him, a mother and a 16-year-old girl. One morning, early morning, a gang from Elkton breaks into the back of the house, goes straight upstairs because somebody in the community obviously tipped them off and they knew exactly where to go. They went upstairs. They tried to capture the mother. She got away. The 16-year-old daughter was still sleeping. They picked her up. She's suddenly screaming, why am I being, what's going on here? They're carrying her down the steps. The daughter of one of the owners opens the second floor door to see what's going on, what the ruckus is, and sees this brute taking down the 16-year-old servant, and she slams the door shut real quick, and he goes downstairs, and then the homeowner hears the ruckus, comes out to confront the gang. One of the thugs puts a gun to his head and says, I'll blow your brains out if you interfere. This was going to be one of the favorite sayings of these kidnappers and the way they operated. Now, is it an arrest or a kidnapping? Many Pennsylvanians said this is obviously a kidnapping. They come in, they invade the home in the early morning hours. There's no warrant presented. The occupants are terrorized. Their lives are threatened. The life of the homeowner is threatened. The 16-year-old girl is abducted. And I have it read for a reason, because this point's going to keep coming up. The abductors did not go to a judge to prove the claim. And I'll point out why this is important. Now, most Marylanders, like the Cecil Whig editor, saw it as a legal arrest of a fugitive slave. The Cecil Whig editor blamed Pennsylvanians for the gang's actions. The law-defying spirit of the citizens and authorities of that state have made it almost, if not entirely, impossible to bring a slave from Pennsylvania. And by law-defining spirit, he's referring to Pennsylvania's Personal Liberty Law of 1847, the fact that abolitionists and anti-slavery agitators, especially among Quakers and African Americans who were rather active, and there were citizens who were assisting freedom seekers. And the editor continued with his rant. Slaveholders are jealous of the rights guaranteed them by law. Large rewards will prompt fearless men to imminent risk. Arrest, or outrages, if you please to call them so, will follow. Blood and death may deepen them into fearful tragedies, and for all the consequences, the people of Pennsylvania will be held accountable. Their executive may demand from ours to the offenders. The demand will be as idle as the wind. They will not be delivered up. I put that in red too for a reason that will be obvious later. As they have substantially legalized the decoying of slaves away, the arresting them by force will be sustained. Let Pennsylvania ponder, and instead of idly ranting, take proper steps to remedy evils for which they are responsible. Now, in this particular case, In this particular case, there's a connection of Quakers in Pennsylvania, Delaware, Baltimore, that were actively trying to protect free blacks from being sold into the slave market, captured and kidnapped and taken into the slave market. Baltimore had a network of Quakers actively involved in protecting the rights of blacks and visited slave dealers to ensure kidnapped victims were not being caught up in ensnared among the slaves. These Quakers communicated with other anti-Quakers in the region. This is likely how the Downingtown residents were able to find the girl in Baltimore and rescue her. The community raised funds to buy her freedom, and she and her mother headed off to Canada right away. Now, here's the point of contention. This is why it was the heart of the problem. Pennsylvania's position. Pennsylvania recognized that slaveholders could rightfully recover a slave, but they felt due process should be followed. There should be a court hearing, there should be a presentation of the claim, and evidence presented. As for kidnapping, that was the seizing of the accused fugitive or a free citizen, removing a person from the state without due process. So it didn't matter if they were free or if they were fugitive, they were entitled to due process in the eyes of Pennsylvania authorities. Now, Maryland saw it different. Maryland's position: slave catching in another state is a constitutional right, with or without due process, as upheld in Prigg versus Pennsylvania, 1842, which pretty much gave slave catchers and kidnappers a free hand, or slave catchers a free hand. Kidnapping, as for whether or not something's a kidnapping, well, we Maryland authorities will decide. We'll look at it. We'll tell you whether or not we think it's a kidnapping. From 1848 to 1851, Thomas McCreary seized at least 9 people in Pennsylvania and Delaware. Maryland considered the Pennsylvania incidents legal arrest, ignored the Delaware incidents, as did Delaware, and protected McCreary as a valued slave catcher. Pennsylvania governors questioned his arrest and requested his extradition 3 times for his most obvious kidnappings. In the Pennsylvania Freedman, I wrote an article that Frederick Douglass had written, in which he referred to McCreary as the notorious kidnapper from Melton. So here's the heart of the problem. From the Maryland point of view, Maryland perspective, Thomas McCreary is a villainous kidnapper, or at least should be tried as such to determine whether or not he is violating the law. From Maryland's view, Thomas McCreary is a heroic slave catcher, a bold defender of Maryland property rights. And then there's the gray area between. And this is exploited by the kidnappers. The kidnappers exploited the murky distinction between legal arrest and kidnappings by ignoring due process and by abdicating free blacks and selling them in the Baltimore slave market. Now this shows a number of incidents. These are McCreary-related incidents, either McCreary directly or indirectly because of his activities and the activities of other slave catchers, kidnappers. As you can see, it's somewhat close to Hockessin. You have incidents around Kennett Square, Unionville, and then over in West and East Nottingham, and also over in Lancaster County, Chestnut Level. And then you had a major incident, in Downingtown. There'll be a second incident in addition to the one I already mentioned. Now, Christiana is going to be a major event, and I'm not going to have time to go into it in detail. I go explain a little more in my book, but it will be important to this story, so I will be touching on it. Oh, also, there are incidents and trials in Philadelphia and Baltimore that are related to McCreary and his community. Downingtown, 1849, kidnapping of Henry Lee Brown. Excuse me. And I suspect the people that were involved in this incident were the ones that tipped off McCreary and his gang. A free black, 16-year-old Henry Lee Brown had worked at the residence of William Evans for 9 years, and he was looking for a better job opportunity. Wanted to do something different. Downingtown resident Solomon States and Amos McFarland told Brown about jobs in Philadelphia. McFarland left for Philadelphia supposedly to line up a job for Brown. And if you're familiar with 12 Years a Slave, and this sounds familiar, yes, this is a major trick that was pulled by kidnappers. They would make bogus job offers. A few days later, Solomon told Brown that McFarland had a job for Brown in Philadelphia, and the two men left Downingtown to join McFarland. Once Brown arrived in Philadelphia with States and joined McFarland for several days, McFarland changed his story. Now, it's his uncle in Wilmington, Delaware, who needs a carriage driver. And if you're a 17-year-old African-American before the Civil War, the idea of being a carriage driver instead of a farmhand sounded rather attractive. And you have nice clothes and you're fairly well taken care of. The three men boarded the train. But all of a sudden, Brown must have had second thoughts. He must have said, wait a minute, I'm heading into a slave state. I'm not sure that's a great idea. So he balks, and he gets off at the next station, still in Philadelphia. And McFarland and his States run out behind him and try to persuade him that yeah, it's a legitimate job offer. You should go ahead and go down there. But he balks. So McFarland contacted two more men, Thomas McCreary and Abel Jeanes. And as I understand, Abel Jeanes is from Hockessin. And they helped persuade Brown to travel to Wilmington. Once the trip resumed, Brown begins to resist again. Whoop, still did the wrong one. McCreary dropped the pretense, pulls out a gun, using force and arms, as the indictment indicates, took Brown to Campbell's slave pen in Baltimore, and sold him as a slave for life. Brown was able to tell his story to Campbell. The story sounded credible to Campbell, who decided to write to Evans. Now, the slave dealers tended to work both sides of the line. They had to be careful. They're working with people involved in illegal actions, but at the same time, they have to look legitimate to the legal authorities. So in this case, Campbell decided, well, I better check out this story, and he sends a letter to Evans. Evans, already suspicious about what happened, acted quickly, came to Baltimore, confirmed the story, and Brown was free again. States and McFarland were imprisoned for kidnapping. Jeanes was tried later and found not guilty. Governor Johnson requested McCreary's extradition from Maryland for kidnapping. And I'm going to come back to what happens on that part of the story in a couple slides. In the meantime, McCreary's involved in another kidnapping. He's working with another gang. McCreary kept getting involved with different gangs. It's a controversial arrest. Mitchell, the gentleman by the name of Mitchell, was working on a farm. He was at a tenant house. He and his wife and a small child. And around midnight, a gang uses a log to bust into the door, enter the house, grab Mitchell, and start pulling him from his bed. The wife starts screaming. She grabs her husband and tries to protect him. They managed to pull Mitchell out. One of the gang members, one of the thugs, pushes the wife against the wall by the throat, puts a gun to her head and says, if you keep resisting, well, I'll blow your brains out. And then he pulls the trigger, and fortunately, gun misfire. And it was dropped. And so they run off with Mitchell, throw him into a carriage, and head for the state line. Mitchell was not taken before a judge. McCreary purchased Mitchell from the supposed owner while on the run. This is another kidnapping trick. The person who made the claim did not have a legitimate claim, or did not seem to have a legitimate claim that Mitchell was a fugitive from his labor. And by the slave catcher buying the accused while on the run, he gets a bill of sale from the person who's supposedly the owner. And then when McCreary takes Mitchell to the slave dealer, he's able to present this bill of sale. The slave dealer has legal cover, and that's the trick that they would pull. Now, the rescuers run to Baltimore and Wilmington, one of his employers and some other people that wanted to protect him, to rescue Mitchell. A network of anti-slavery Quakers became involved. Those going to Baltimore ran into resistance. Tom's employers temporarily jailed because the person who originally claimed to be the owner was suing him for stealing his labor that he was entitled to from Mitchell. But he was released because the judge was being honest about it and said, well, you want to file that suit, you have to file in Pennsylvania where it occurred, and that didn't happen. He didn't follow up. The community held an indignation or protest meeting. The communities, and not just this community, Unionville, but a number of communities along the state line were forming these leagues, these self-protection leagues. And Quakers were also concerned about these invaders coming in and terrorizing communities, snatching people up, and they wanted it to stop, and they felt that the laws and the Supreme Court rulings and the laws were unfair and allowing these thugs to come into these communities and cause all this disruption. And then, though neighbors raised the money to buy Tom's freedom, I believe it was $600, what it would have been worth at the time, one local resident felt that he was as likely to be kidnapped again as ever. For I do not believe any of them is safe. There's a great many would steal a Negro for $600 rather than to go to work, provided the law did not get hold of them. The Maryland governor investigated Pennsylvania's extradition request for the Philadelphia kidnapping. The governor asked for information on McCreary from Cecil County Clerk of the Court Richard Holliday, a political ally of the governor. Before he had this position, Holliday was the Secretary of State and was working directly with the governor, so they were very tightly connected. Holliday is confused, or he pretends to be, and defends McCreary's actions at Unionville, which is an entirely different situation. Guilty, and says, guilty of no offense recognized by the Constitution and laws of the U.S. Holliday declared McCreary almost invaluable to the slaveholders of the state in the arrest of runaways. At the Maryland State House, now get this next line. McCreary hand-delivered the letter to the governor. Now think about that a moment. The accused, McCreary, is delivering the letter to the governor. He gets to tell his side of the story. Is Mitchell going to get that opportunity? No way. Holiday added a postscript to the letter. McCreary has for years been active in the arrest of runaways and abolitionists, have heaped an unlimited amount of abuse on his head. This whole prosecution has been gotten up for his destruction. I am sure the governor, if he can consistently do so, will not grant this warrant for his surrender. Were it granted, I do not believe it could be executed at this place. He's indicating people in Elkton would not allow it. Governor Philip Thomas was an outspoken advocate for the right to recapture accused fugitive slaves in other states without interference. Pennsylvania attorneys will mention this refusal to extradite during the Christiana treason trial as an example of Maryland slave owners operating with impunity along the border. And a reminder of what the editor of the Cecil Vegas said earlier. Their executive made demand for minority offenders. The demand will be as idle as the wind. They will not be delivered up. 1849, McCreary, by deception in Maryland law, will in effect kidnap John Jackson, a free black teenager lord from Pennsylvania, by a bogus job offer. Now this story is kind of unusual and a little confusing, but the first time Jackson comes in, McCreary tells Jackson there's a job waiting for him in Elkton and a place to stay. And he brings Jackson into Maryland, into Elkton, and as they're walking along past the jail, let's say McCreary didn't provide him with a job, but he did provide him with a place to stay, the jail. And Jackson was, because he had entered the state illegally, because if you were a free black from another state entering Maryland, you were violating the law. So he's fined $20. A gentleman by the name of Lindsay from Philadelphia was involved in the Abolitionist Society, came down, paid the fine, and warned him not to go back. Now, for some reason, I talk about this in the book, but it's kind of unclear as to what was going on here. But Jackson is bored back a second time. This time, the fine is $500. And he can't pay it, and nobody shows up to help. McCreary was the one that arrested him. As a constable, he arrested him. Or even any citizen in Maryland could arrest a fugitive and claim a reward. Now, if in this case, McCreary was going to get half the proceeds for the auction to sell Jackson into slavery. Well, as it turns out, McCreary bought him. So he bought a human being at a 50% discount and took him down to Baltimore and sold him into slavery at a profit. Pennsylvania attorneys will retell this incident at the Christiana treason trial as an example of Maryland's disregard for the rights of black Pennsylvania residents. Now, other Mason-Dixon line. Maryland and Delaware were sister slave states, but they were not identical twins. For one reason is because they had a rather active anti-slavery newspaper called the Blue Hen's Chicken. And the editors there criticized the Maryland law that led to Jackson's enslavement. The Cecil Wint responded to the Blue Hen Chicken. That law was to prevent the colored emissaries of abolitionists in Delaware and beyond that state from interfering with Maryland slaves. All, or nearly all, of the laws which bear with severity upon the blacks have been occasioned by the intermeddling of these northern men who, while professing to be friends of the Negro, are his worst enemies. Then there's another incident. McCreary's not involved in this, but McCreary's is indirectly involved because McCreary was what they were worried about. Well, let me explain. A black family missed the Newark stop. conductor said, next stop is Elkton, and they panicked. African Americans on board the train were concerned that they could be arrested, fined, and have the same kind of problem Jackson had. They recognized the danger of possible enslavement. The husband holding the child jumped from the train as it was starting to build up steam. The mother was going to follow, but the train was getting, as the train was building speed, the other passengers were afraid that she would be injured if she jumped. So they stopped her. She became hysterical. Well, she panicked. She was extremely frightened. She felt that she was going to be sold into slavery, that McCreary's reputation was such that they were worried, that they knew the slave catchers like McCreary were active on the Maryland side of that line. So she was quite frightened. Now, as it turns out, the people on the Maryland side of the line, McCreary wasn't there, and the people who were there did see that she was safely returned. After describing the incident, the correspondent to the Blue Hen's Chicken concluded, no doubt, had Mr. McCreary, the slave catcher, been present at the depot, he would have seized this unfortunate woman, who would have probably been sold into slavery to be separated from her husband and children, for the sake of getting the amount which the odious law of the state allows. And McCreary could have been there because he liked hanging out at the railroad station, because it gave him a network of contacting other fugitives or other slave dealers, kidnappers. The Cecil Democrat warned citizens to watch out for Delaware abolitionists. The Cecil Democrat decries the Blue Hen's Chicken article sympathetic to fugitives and the abolitionists assisting them. The Blue Hen's Chicken exults in the escape of 16 slaves. The abolitionists are very active in aiding the escape of slaves, that the Underground Railroad extends a considerable distance down that state, and that branches of it extend into Maryland. Maryland needed to keep a watchful eye on these emissaries. Some of them are well known, and with all the cunning and shrewdness what the chicken ascribes to them. A stop should be put to the nefarious proceedings of the abolitionists at whatever cost. And at about the same time as this article was coming out, Harriet Tubman was making her escape up through the network in Delaware. I'm going to have to do a lot of summarizing. The gang attempts to kidnap Ann Brown in Wilmington, Delaware. McCreary joined with Marylanders Elijah E. Massey and Marcy Fountain to arrest Ann Brown, and I have arresting quotes, in the Hedgeville section of Wilmington. They were assisted by Constable Isaac Clark. Ann's brother physically confronted the gang. The claimants, Elijah Massey and his brother, agreed to go to court. The Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society investigated the claim after the first time they tried to kidnap her. This was the second time the Massey gang tried to kidnap Ann Brown. Knowing they could not support the claim in court, the kidnappers offered to sell her back for $100. Not a dollar, not a cent will we pay you, said Thomas Garrett to Fountain's urgent solicitation for a compromise. The claimant skipped the trial and Ann Brown was freed. The Massey family, unwilling to accept the manumission granted in a will years earlier, had acted illegally out of sense of entitlement and greed. And this was another trick that a lot of times heirs would not tell people if they were manumitted. Or if they were manumitted, they didn't like it. And they tried to kidnap and get the other person back because they were valuable property and worth a lot of money. The check-in emphasized the arrest was made without a warrant. Public opinion ought to point the finger of scorn and contempt at all those who hire themselves out as bloodhounds to hunt human beings in order to reduce them to slavery. The check-in complained that most of the constables of the state are leagued with slave catchers and dealers, and by this means perpetuate the most diabolical wrong. And by the way, nothing came of the kidnapping. Well, never mind. I'm going to skip this one. It's in the book, but it's a case of a mother and child being brought back. The mother was a fugitive, and her child was born in free territory. And as one person pointed out, he was not a fugitive from labor, but the mother and the child ended up enslaved back in Maryland, sold back deeper south, into the deep south. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Claimants required to take accused before a federal judge or commissioner. That's in red for a significant reason. Slave catchers may request federal assistance. Citizens could be compelled to assist, jail for those hindering a capture or assisting a fugitive, and a general description is sufficient. The critics responded that there's a loss of states' rights. The South did not want the Northern courts to make these rulings. They wanted the federal government to do it. All of a sudden, they weren't concerned about states' rights. Not when they considered slave property as much more important of an issue. Critics noticed poor protection for the rights of the accused. No jury trials, no appeals, no opportunity for fugitives to submit evidence. The slaveholder or agent had an advantage of resources. The general description was too vague. She was tall, she was short, she was kind of dark black, she was a medium black, and so on. So very vague. I'm going to skip this too. These are two trials, however, where the first two trials held in Philadelphia for the Fugitive Slave Act, and both of them proved to be in both cases, they were falsely accused, and it was determined, and they were returned back to freedom. I go into a lot more detail in the book, of course. And in July, Delaware residents Elias Newdane and George Crone, along with Thomas McCreary, conspired to illegally remove from Delaware two limited-term slaves, John Kennard and Elizabeth Williams, and sell them to a Baltimore slave dealer as slaves for life. They were held at McCreary's home because they missed a train. They had to stay overnight. And when McCreary tried to handcuff John Kennard resisted and would not allow. And then he went over to the window and yelled, "Kidnappers, murderers, robbers!" and created a ruckus. The town people came running over to see what was going on, and then they realized that they've been taken out of Delaware illegally, and they were returned back to Delaware. As for the people involved in the kidnapping, nothing came of it. Thomas Garrett stated this type of kidnapping was operated in Delaware for the last 10 years at an alarming rate. In other words, you could have somebody released from jail and use them as a short-term slave as part of their sentence, but then all of a sudden they disappear, and the person who had held them said, "Oh, I don't know what happened. They escaped. They're gone." And actually they were taken down to Baltimore and sold into the slave market. All right, McCreary's kidnapping and arrest with different accomplices in Pennsylvania and Delaware suggests McCreary acted as an intermediary between kidnappers and slave catchers in northern Delaware and southeast Pennsylvania and the Baltimore slave markets. All right, Christianity I don't have time to get into now, but the incident was rather important in American history, and the slave catcher, the slave owner who tried to recover someone he had enslaved, was killed in a resistance at Christianity. Southern states were enraged, especially Maryland, and they pressed for treason trials for everybody involved, under the circumstances. Now, in November, December 1851, the Christiana treason trial was held. Pennsylvania attorneys referred to McCreary as an example of the borderers who abduct Pennsylvania citizens and caused the need for self-defense leagues along the Mason-Dixon line. The Maryland Attorney General, who insisted in being involved in the prosecution, expressed a one-sided interpretation of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which I'll come back to in a moment. Hanway was acquitted and other treason cases dropped. Hanway was a Quaker who, of the community, he and another Quaker showed up on the scene to try to assist. They were trying to prevent a riot, and they got accused by the marshal of being the instigators or the leaders, because they couldn't imagine the African Americans being their own leaders. They felt that the leaders had to be white, and they got falsely accused. In the meantime, in a parallel during that same period, September 1851, McCreary had debt problems again, constantly in debt. Early December, McCreary abducted Elizabeth Parker, a 12-year-old girl. December, shortly after Attorney Reed announced McCreary at the trial, a Pennsylvania posse attempted to arrest McCreary at Chestnut Level, a village in Lancaster County. In December, the end of December, Thomas McCreary kidnapped Elizabeth's sister, 17-year-old Rachel Parker. McCreary accuses the two sisters of running away from Baltimore Omer in 1847, but he does not go before a federal judge to make the claim. A clear violation of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Is it going to make a difference? Stay tuned. Now, the Maryland and McCreary's interests merge again, but the aftermath of Christiana will make it more significant. All right, this repeats what I said about the kidnappings. And then in December 1851, Maryland is furious about the trial's outcome, the acquittals, and the dropping of the other cases, and they were angry about Gorsuch's death. Baltimoreans considered Pennsylvania abolitionists the instigators of events in Christiana. So if you were in Pennsylvania going into Baltimore and you were concerned about somebody being kidnapped, you were automatically assumed to be an abolitionist, and you were in deep trouble. They were not critical thinkers, so they automatically assumed if you're from Pennsylvania, you have to be an abolitionist, and they had to keep an eye on you. You were in trouble. So December 31 to January 1st, 1852, Joseph Miller, Rachel's employer, and 7 of his friends and neighbors rushed to Baltimore. They obtained the assistance of Frederick Corcoran, a Baltimore Quaker. Rachel Parker is partially rescued, meaning they saved her from going into the slave market and being sold to the South. But they couldn't take her home because Maryland authorities wanted to clear up whether or not she was a fugitive slave or if she had been free. And until she proved it, she had to sit in jail. As the rescuers move about the city, a hostile crowd follows the group as they move about the city, labeling them the murderers of Gorsuch. Miller disappears at the Baltimore train station later that day. Whoop. The next morning, Miller is found hanging from a tree. January 1852, the kidnapping trial against McCreary is derailed by the Machiavellian maneuvers of Maryland Governor Enoch Lowe and the former Governor Philip Thomas, who refused to extradite McCreary back in 1849. A new trial is scheduled, and then repeatedly rescheduled, and then kind of disappears. Rachel Parker is returned to prison. A petition for freedom is filed. In the spring, a group of Baltimoreans financially backed the effort to locate Elizabeth Parker in New Orleans. The Pennsylvania legislature provided legal support for both sisters, and the governor appointed lawyers for the sisters. After 1 full year sitting in a prison, in prison, Rachel Parker finally gets her hearing. January 1853, the trial for the plea for freedom for Rachel and Elizabeth Parker. When they found Elizabeth, her fate and her older sister's fate were tied together. Over 60 white and I have an asterisk for that, and I'll explain that in a moment. Over 60 white witnesses, including relatives of Thomas McCreary, traveled from Pennsylvania to Baltimore on behalf of these two black teenagers. One of American history's greatest acts of compassion in the face of hostility. They were not abolitionists. They were there because Rachel and Elizabeth were members of their community, known to be free black citizens, and were in danger of being forcibly enslaved. As for the asterisk, African Americans from Pennsylvania could not have joined to help. They could not have been witnesses. They would not have been allowed to testify. And don't forget the Jackson story. They could have been fined. They could have ended up enslaved themselves. It would have been counterproductive for them to have gone. Governor Bigler requests the extradition of McCreary for kidnapping. Among his multiple reasons was the fact McCreary had violated the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 by not going before a federal judge. Governor Lowe denies the request with convoluted reasoning. The real reason, from Maryland's point of view, allowing a Pennsylvania court to argue that McCreary was a kidnapper and allowing a Pennsylvania jury to declare him guilty would undermine the South's constitutional right to unrestricted recovery of slaves in the northern states. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, in Maryland's point of view, was for northern states to strictly obey or risk shattering the Union. Southern slaveholders and their agents, on the other hand, had the option of following the law when it was helpful, or on the other hand, had the option of not following when it interfered with their constitutional right. This view in the fugitive slave law was the same argument Maryland made at the Christiana treason trial. The historic marker dedication in 2011 for the Parker kidnapping and rescue, and I had the honor of being requested to be one of the speakers. It was the plaque reads, emboldened by the 1850 fugitive slave law, Maryland's slave catchers kidnapped Rachel and Elizabeth Parker from the Nottingham area in 1851. Rachel's employer, Joseph Miller, was murdered in a failed attempt to rescue her from Baltimore. Public outrage led Pennsylvania officials to seek the sisters' release in a Maryland civil court case that secured their freedom in 1853. The forcible enslavement of two young free black women galvanized anti-slavery sentiment. And this is a picture of Rachel. This was a picture they used in her obituary. Questions? I don't know. Do we have time for questions, or should I?
Maybe at the end. Maybe at the
This
end.
is the end.
No, at the end of the program.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. We've got Matt Myers, who has consented to come out and talk to us a little bit. So come on up, Matt.
Good evening. Let's give another round of applause for Mr. Diggins. Milton Diggins. How many people here are students? Raise your hand if you're a student in school. We got 4. Not you, Xavier. My former 7th grade math student, Xavier, I just hired him to work for the county like me. You're not getting any prizes here. I got a question for the students. I think in Pete, an ice cream cone is at stake, right? You can get him an ice cream cone, a free ice cream cone.
Absolutely.
No calling out. We're here in Juneteenth week, right? June 19th is Juneteenth. Why don't we do, I can do a couple ice cream cones. First question for the kids is, what is Juneteenth about? What is Juneteenth commemorating? Yeah, is that Tosh? Yeah. Uh-huh. Say it loud so everybody can hear.
The day when the union settled taxes and
Good. You give them a round of applause. The union controlled the taxes and let enslaved persons know they're free. They actually legally were free for 2.5 years before that, but they didn't know. They're actually 2 states in the country, Todd, there were 2 states. We still have more questions, so kids, you want to pay attention. There's ice cream cone at stake. There are 2 states in the country that the slaves, that people were still legally enslaved in, even after Juneteenth. Don't know? Any of the students know which 2 states those are?
Louisiana.
No, not Louisiana. Can you name one of the states and the students? Yes.
Delaware.
Delaware. Good. Delaware is one of those states. Good. Delaware. Get that man an ice cream cone. All right, an ice cream cone for anybody. Can anybody tell me what the other state was?
Texas.
Yeah.
Maryland?
Not Maryland.
Texas.
Not Texas. Anybody? Kentucky. Kentucky. They weren't freed until the ratification of, I believe, I'm a lawyer, I should know, I think the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. I'm right, Dr. Edwards? Okay. Delaware and Kentucky. They weren't free until the ratification. Anyway, my name is Matt. I'm county executive. I always like to sort of throw back and try to be a teacher again. So thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you especially to everyone at the Hockessin Historical Society. If you're a member of the society, would you just raise your hand? Great. Give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you. I like to joke that I can barely remember what I did yesterday or the day before. And to think that we know with a considerable degree of certainty what was going on in Galveston, Texas in June of 1865. You think about just the human effort it took to know what was going on then. A lot of it has to do with individuals like Pete Seeley, like Darlene Amobi, volunteers saying that they want this history told, spending their time, individuals like Councilwoman Kilpatrick and Newcastle County Council that invest in programs like this to make sure that this history is told, so for many years and generations into the future, we'll be able to know and tell this history so that some of our horrific past will never, ever be repeated. On that note, has Sunny Knott been introduced? Has anyone talked about Sunny Knott? We have a tremendous gift in our community now. I think many of you know that we did not have when I first stood here a few years ago. And that is Hockessin Colored School number 107 that had fallen into disrepair. It's now refurbished with a whole bunch of new energy. It's now a center for, David Will, help me out, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Yes. Is that right? Did I say it right? It's a Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Good. Give them a round of applause. Tremendous amount of work. That work wouldn't have happened without David, without Dr. Edwards, without many of you here, and especially with Sunny Knott, making sure he organizes the students who actually went to that school to tell their history. When David first came to talk to me, and the group from a group of friends at Hockessin Colored School came to talk to me 5-6 years ago about refurbishing the school, they said we need to do it fast. These students, these alums, are not going to be here forever. I'm sorry, each time I see Sonny, I think Sonny may be here forever. The guy doesn't get any older. He just gets younger. You know, my hair gets gray, his does not. So it's great to be here. Without further ado, let me just read this proclamation we have here for Juneteenth. I'm not going to read every word, but I'll read the selected sections. Be it hereby known to all that I, Matthew Myers, County Executive, recognize Juneteenth, June 19, 2023. Whereas President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, declaring that all enslaved people be free. And whereas on June 19, 1865, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Union soldiers traveled to Galveston, Texas, where the last enslaved African Americans lived, and shared the delayed news that the Civil War had ended and those enslaved were free. And whereas Juneteenth commemorates the emancipation of the last enslaved African Americans in the United States and is a yearly celebration of freedom and of African American culture. Whereas Delaware's Juneteenth celebration especially honors and remembers Shirley Beulah and the Beulah family for their contributions towards the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And whereas for grade school, Shirley Beulah's parents drove her to the black school named the Hockessin Colored School 107C, By the time she was 8 years old, her parents grew tired of driving her 2 miles to Hockessin when each day a bus went right by their home on its way to a far better white school. And whereas in 1951, with the help of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the Beulah family sued for their daughter to be able to ride the bus close to their home and asked the state court for admission to the white school. Whereas after the decision in Beulah's favor was upheld by the Delaware Supreme Court, an appeal by the State Board of Education reached the United States Supreme Court as part of a bundle of cases that we now know as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The Delaware case was unique. I think many of you here know it was the only case where the rights of the plaintiff to attend a white school were upheld. It's something that we can all be proud of in Delaware. Now therefore, I, Matthew Myers, County Executive of Newcastle County, by virtue of the authority vested in me, do hereby proclaim June 19th, 2023 as Juneteenth in Newcastle County in honor of Shirley Beulah and her family. I particularly commend the Hockessin Historical Society for coordinating an informative Juneteenth event to educate county residents on this holiday's history and the continued importance in today's world and long into the future. Thank you. And also, you guys all have programs, right? My communications guy is saying next time I do a headshot, it should look like Lucas Clausen's headshot.
All right, hang on 1 second. Let me get the early.
Good.
What do you want for the background? You want, is this a second? Awesome, thank you.
2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3.
You're awesome. Thanks. Thank you.
Lucas, you're on.
All right.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Everybody see the screen okay? Everything set up? Everybody hear me fine in the back? Excellent. Well, I am Lucas Clausen, historian at Hagley Museum and Library here in Wilmington. And the topic I'm going to talk with you about tonight, contrabands in Lincoln's war policy, may not on the surface seem like a local story or a Delaware story. But I'll make all the connections back into you as we go through the narrative. So by show of hands, just because I'm curious, how many of you have ever heard of contrabands, know what I'm even talking about by contrabands? Good, 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 good. There's a lot of people here in the crowd. This is a topic that I find not a lot of people who, even if they're familiar with Civil War history, knows anything about. So related to this, before we even get going, how many of you have heard of Jim Crow laws? Good. I find that that's another topic that I have to spend a bit of time explaining to folks, but I'm glad that you all are with me here on what a Jim Crow law is. So without further ado, let's get started on contrabands in Lincoln's war policy. Our story is going to start in an unlikely place with an unlikely person. This fellow, Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler, who was a political appointee to the U.S. Army from the state of Massachusetts. He was a lawyer and known as quite a cunning one. He was also known as Beast Butler because he wasn't considered to be a very good-looking fellow, but also considered boorish in his manners, somebody who's kind of a bull in a china shop, if you will. When the war got going, he found himself in command of this place, Fortress Monroe, which is on a little spit of land in Virginia. So this is an important thing to point out. Fortress Monroe is right here. Notice that it's by Norfolk, Richmond, Newport News. In 1861, that was all Confederate territory. So this was a little spit of land with the United States fort on it, commanded by Benjamin Butler. So he's kind of in a bit of a place, kind of stuck out on his own. In May of 1861, some enslaved folks made their way into Fortress Monroe. They came into the fort, he let them in. their owners came a couple of days later, knocked on the door and said, hey, we want these guys back. You know, they came over under a flag of truce. Benjamin Butler thought about it a little bit. He was known to not like secessionists in any way whatsoever, known to not like people of the then Democratic Party in any way whatsoever. So he was kind of against the people who were coming to get their slaves back. Thinking about it a little bit, he said, no, I will not give them back to you because I declare they are contrabands of war. So an important point to make in all this is that until the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, in the United States, slaves were not people, they were property. Let me say that again. Until the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, slaves were property, not people. So a lot of the arguments that you hear running up to the American Civil War starting about property rights, that's what this is all about. So make no mistake, the American Civil War has slavery at its heart because of the issues of property rights. So Benjamin Butler makes this distinction. They are contraband of war because they're property owned by slaveholders. I'm going to declare that we can take them from you because they're helping you. This is property that is aiding and abetting the enemy. So this is the distinction that he made. So word about this traveled pretty fast. That there was this guy on Fortress Monroe where if you make it there, if you were an escaped slave and you make it to Fortress Monroe, you don't have to go back. So Edward Pierce, who was a Massachusetts soldier at Fortress Monroe, who later became a member of the Freedmen's Bureau, wrote that proclaim an edict of emancipation in the hearing of a single slave on the Potomac, and in a few days it will be known by his brethren in the Gulf. And so everybody in the peninsula, the Delmarva Peninsula, heard about this, absolutely started flocking to Fortress Monroe. Benjamin Butler didn't know what to do about it. He was kind of surprised that all of a sudden black faces showed up at the front of Fortress Monroe, which he immediately let in. So much so that you know you've arrived whenever they start making political cartoons about you and your actions. So this is one from 1861 called the Fortress Monroe Doctrine, kind of lampooning the fact that these escaped slaves could make it into Fortress Monroe and they wouldn't have to go back. So let's fast forward a little bit in time to the Battle of Port Royal in South Carolina on November 7th, 1861. So maybe some of you have heard of Samuel Francis DuPont, one of our kind of local heroes here in Delaware. Before anybody knew who he was a lowly captain in the United States Navy, charged with getting a toehold in South Carolina. So he sails into Port Royal, wins the first major victory for Union forces during the American Civil War. So this is a huge thing. The U.S. Army had lost at the Battle of Manassas, that they were getting beat left and right. So this was a huge, bright spot for U.S. forces, for the U.S. government. And to give you a bit of a perspective of where Port Royal is located, Charleston, South Carolina being here, if you've ever been to Hilton Head, that's Port Royal. It's also not far from Savannah, Georgia. So note this is in the heart of Confederate territory. So this is right in the heart of the Deep South. Samuel Francis DuPont hoped that by going there, it would be a way to get into Charleston, South Carolina, which was seen as the hotbed of the Confederacy. This is where secession started. So South Carolina being the first state to secede, Samuel Francis DuPont wanted to strike a blow there. So among all of the enslaved peoples in Georgia, South Carolina, the Battle of Port Royal was known as the Day of the Big Gun Shoot. They said that themselves over and over again, in part because the U.S. Navy sailed in with an entire squadron of ships and just absolutely bombarded the Confederate points at Hilton Head. And the Confederates hadn't been there long. They had only been at their post about 24 hours. So once the U.S. Navy arrived, starting the bombardment, the Confederates got scared and got the heck out of Dodge. I mean, they threw down their stuff and ran away. It was an absolute rout of Confederate forces. So that's part of the reason why this is known as such a huge victory. So just as at Fortress Monroe, everyone who was enslaved in the local area knew that if they could get to Port Royal, they felt like, well, maybe the same thing will happen with us. And it did. So you see these contrabands of war, because that distinction had been made, that's something that had been circulated through the U.S. military. They come to Port Royal, now what do you do with all these people? That's the question that the U.S. military had. So a lot of these escaped slaves ended up working as servants for U.S. Army officers, working in some of the headquarters as cooks, as cleaners, Same thing that happened like at Fort Delaware. You see a lot of folks who are working in domestic sort of situations. Nothing like technology to ruin your day. Okay, so after a lot of these folks ended up working as domestic servants, cooks, cleaners, that sort of thing, a lot of the escaped slaves, the contrabands, ended up working, making fortifications, doing manual labor for the U.S. Army in and around Port Royal. So this was one of the major things that some of these especially men, got employed doing. Also working for the United States Army as teamsters, so moving things, driving horses. That's where a lot of these men ended up getting employed. So a lot of the folks who made it into Port Royal and the local area ended up getting used in this way. Very importantly for our story, they got enlisted in the United States Navy. So there was no law in the United States that said a man of color couldn't be enlisted in the U.S. Navy. So Samuel Francis DuPont saw this as a way to solve a huge manpower problem at the beginning of the war. The U.S. Army needed a lot of people, so too did the Navy, but black men could not enlist in the Army in 1861-62. So he said, sure, bring them all in. We need all the people that we can get. So all these men, he enlisted them. These are escaped slaves who joined the U.S. Navy and put aboard the USS Vermont. This was around Port Royal, South Carolina in 1862. And so some of these men, because they knew the area, they became pilots on some of Admiral DuPont's ships. Ended up doing some pretty important jobs with the U.S. Navy. Another incredibly important thing that contrabands did were serve as points of intelligence. So don't forget, these people knew the local area, and they were more than happy to tell the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy exactly where Confederate camps were, exactly where all the roads went, exactly how deep all the water was for navigating boats. So they're able to tell these guys, here's where you go, here's what you do. We're more than happy to provide intelligence to tell you local conditions, local people, again, where to go, what to do, everything that you need to know to carry on a campaign in the Southeast. Concurrent with this, you have a bit of political maneuvering going on. So two U.S. Army generals, one John C. Fremont and the other one David Hunter, who were avowed abolitionists before the war and as the war started, decided that, well, we're in these places, we're going to make edicts of emancipation. So John Fremont made his in Missouri in August 30th, 1861. David Hunter, who was with Samuel Francis DuPont in South Carolina, made his edict on May 9, 1862. This was an incredibly controversial thing because this is a U.S. Army commander in the field making a decision outside of the formal chain of command of the U.S. government to free slaves in the areas where they were. David Hunter took things one step further and actually enlisted a lot of the contraband into regiments of infantry. So they were called the 1st and 2nd South Carolina Infantry. Part of the reason why this was so incredibly controversial was that you take firearms and put them in the hands of people of color. And that was just absolutely beyond anything a lot of people in the United States saw as permissible in 1861. So David Hunter got the nickname as Black Dave for wanting to enlist these men. And so being a friend of the black man, as it was called, he later got called Black David Hunter because of how much he wanted to burn things in all of his various commands. But that was a title that stuck with him throughout the rest of the American Civil War. But this is an incredibly controversial action for him and John C. Fremont. So the initial government response was to endorse Benjamin Butler's contraband doctrine, but to reject Fremont's and Hunter's edicts. So this is something the U.S. government saw as too controversial and didn't reprimand them for it, but made them reverse, made Fremont and David Hunter reverse their edicts. But because they were able to take the idea of Benjamin Butler and the idea of contraband of war This got pushed through for what's called the First and Second Confiscation Act. So this further allows the U.S. government to take away property of people who are actively rebelling against the United States. The First Confiscation Act in August 1861 states that the government can take property used in aiding the rebellion. So that's legal pretense to take away slaves because they saw that Confederates were using enslaved peoples to make fortifications, to make uniforms, to make firearms, to make ammunition, those sorts of things. So this is one of the reasons they were able to make this distinction and carry it through. They took it further with the Second Confiscation Act in July 17, 1862, by saying the government can take the property of people who aid the rebellion. So remember back to the idea of property and not people. So if you are property who are aiding the rebellion, you can legally be taken. If you are property of someone who's actively rebelling against the United States, your property can be taken. So these are ways that the U.S. government, again, takes Benjamin Butler's contraband distinction, moves it a little further down the line. So this all poses a bit of a dilemma for Abraham Lincoln. So he is pretty famous in throwing out that the war for him was initially to preserve the Union and not about emancipation. He wanted emancipation, but through a constitutional amendment, through Congress making an act, not through war. So once the war started, his initial war aim was to bring the Union back together, then solve the problem of emancipation. And he also didn't want to alienate the border states. So these were states that weren't in active rebellion that still allowed slavery. So it's Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And he also does not want to alienate the American people. So realizing how controversial this whole issue is, he doesn't want to be considered as taking things too far. So he wants to be able to do this again within the rule of law and not through executive order. And he also argued pretty vociferously that permanent change has to come from the law and not by executive order. So he's not terribly worried about the United States Supreme Court, because through the writ of habeas corpus, he's been able to pretty much suspend the U.S. Supreme Court during the war. What he's worried about is the U.S. Congress, realizing that if he makes an executive order, the U.S. Congress can immediately pass a law to rescind that executive order. And knowing how many people who were in the U.S. Congress, especially the congressional delegation from Delaware, who were part of the then Democratic Party, they didn't like Lincoln at all, and they were most certainly not going to go along with any executive order. So what does he do about this? This gets Lincoln thinking, how are the war aims going? What can I do to change things? So in 1862, this is when he starts thinking about emancipation in a big way and making that a war aim, because he realizes that if he can knock the prop out from under the Confederacy, you effectively end the reason why they're fighting. So how do we do this in a way? How do we emancipate slaves in the U.S. without alienating people? Bring Delaware back into the story. The Lincoln administration thought about the policy of compensated emancipation. So we purchase people's slaves. So if the U.S. government can purchase them and free them, then that effectively ends the problem. So where can I start? Where can I think about this, trying this out? Delaware. Delaware had the smallest slave population during the American Civil War. So in the census of 1860, there's 1,798 slaves in the state of Delaware. He sees, well, this is a good idea. Let's try it here. So U.S. Representative George Fisher from Delaware, he had him take this idea to the Delaware General Assembly. The Delaware General Assembly, which were controlled by the then Democratic Party, very much disliked this and told him to essentially get lost. So rather than see this bill get defeated in the General Assembly, he withdrew it, and for his trouble lost his election in 1862 as U.S. Representative. So what this showed the Lincoln administration is this is not going to work. If it's not going to work in Delaware, which he thought was relatively friendly to some of these ideas, there's no way it's going to work in Maryland, Kentucky, or Missouri, even with the U.S. military effectively controlling a lot of those areas. Part of what he realizes, too, is you need to change the hearts and minds of people in the United States about this issue. So Samuel Francis DuPont, we bring back into the story. He didn't realize how bad slavery actually was until he encountered it in South Carolina. That he said to his wife in one of his letters, a hog in Massachusetts has it better than a slave in South Carolina. And a direct quote from him as well. "I have seen the institution, and may God forgive me for the words I have ever uttered in its defense as intertwined with the Constitution." So he wrote a lot of letters back to his family here in Delaware saying, no, this is not easy. This is not a fun thing. This is not what people tell you. This is awful. That if you see the way these people are forced to live, if you see how their masters shoot them down rather than let them be free, you see the attitudes of the people who are down here, you would see that this is not anything like you think it is. It's not like it's portrayed in the papers. This is terrible. We need to do something to change this. So not only is Admiral DuPont and a lot of his contemporaries writing back, everybody who sees this stuff in the areas where the U.S. military goes writes back. So you have a lot of politicians, a lot of missionaries, a lot of other people who are able to see it firsthand to try to write these letters, convince people in changing the hearts and minds. The Lincoln administration capitalizes on that in a big way and gets people like these guys. The Reverend Mansfield French, who was from New England, he had him go to Port Royal in South Carolina to see slavery firsthand and try to work out a solution of what to do about it. But then also General Rufus Saxton, who was one of the commanding generals in South Carolina. So had him go on goodwill tours in the Northeast and take contraband with them to tell their stories. So people like Robert Smalls, who was an escaped slave who stole a boat from Charleston, South Carolina, with him and all of his family, made it out to the U.S. blockading squadron. It ended up being a pretty sensational thing. So they took Robert Smalls on a tour of the Northeast to tell his story about how he escaped, how he would rather see his entire family die in combat, essentially, than go back into slavery. So this is one of the ways that you help change the hearts and minds of U.S. citizens. This gradually moves us toward policy shifts. So one of the main people involved in changing the policies, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who finally authorized the enlistment of contrabands in the U.S. Army. But an important distinction to make is that contrabands at this point, so this is mid-1862, can't hold guns, they can't fight. They can join and be Teamsters officially in the Army. They can be cooks, they can work on fortifications, they can be drivers, things like that, but they're not officially soldiers quite yet. But this is a big step forward, allowing the official enlistment into the U.S. Army. So steps forward in all of this, the Lincoln administration decides in mid-1862 to issue an Edict of Emancipation, but they wait on a good time for it. There's a lot of bad things happening for the U.S. Army, a lot of defeats, one after the other, in Virginia, out west, other places. So he waits until after the Battle of Antietam in Maryland on September 17, 1862, which was not exactly a Union victory, but a draw. He sees this as a good time to roll out a policy change. So this is when the Lincoln administration, after the battle, issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation to see what's going to happen. And a lot of people didn't like it. But there were Union soldiers who said, this is not what I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for the Union, not for slavery. I'm walking out of here. But there are other people who said, you know, this is a good idea, especially whenever they heard the reasons why. And it got so much positive traction, not only with the Army, with the armed services, but with the citizens of the U.S. This leads to the issuance of the full Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. So this is an incredibly important document in our story because it does two main things. You know, there's a lot of bits and pieces to this, but there's two main things that happen. First and foremost, it declares slaves free in areas of active rebellion. And it lists out all the places where slaves aren't free, and there's an important reason for that. That's because that's where the U.S. Navy and Army already were. And that's where the First and Second Confiscation Acts were already in effect. So wherever the military was, you already had emancipation. So that's a big part of the Emancipation Proclamation. The second part of this, which was the most controversial, is that it finally allowed enlistment of black men into the Army as soldiers. So now they could be issued firearms, they could be soldiers in the U.S. Army. So this is an incredibly important document that moves us toward finally ending slavery in the United States. So this gets a positive reception among slaves and contrabands. Contrabands love it because now these people can be soldiers. They can do something that they've wanted for a while, enlist in the U.S. Army and strike back against the people who held them in slavery. But the people who were enslaved in areas of active rebellion saw this as a light of hope. They're realizing that the U.S. government is finally officially doing something. And they saw that in some cases they weren't doing anything up to that point. They weren't sure, in a lot of cases, even what the war was about, what it was for. So this is a huge shift for everyone, not only the citizens of the U.S., but people in enslaved areas. A big part of the story comes with the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. So how many of you have seen the film Glory? Good. So this depicts this battle of Battery Wagner on July 18, 1863. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment was raised from Massachusetts, primarily of men not just from Massachusetts, but people who were contrabands who were able to enlist with this Massachusetts regiment. So they went into combat. This was the first major combat that black men saw in the American Civil War as part of officially the U.S. Army. And it was an absolute rout for U.S. forces, but what it showed is that these soldiers would fight, that they could be trained, they could do all the things that white soldiers could do and more, especially die. And that was a really important point to make to the U.S. public, was that these people were willing to fight and die for their own freedom. And we all think, of course, that's kind of an obvious thing, but back to changing the hearts and minds of people in the U.S., if you want a policy shift, if you want to change the law, it all has to be ratified by the states, it all has to be voted on, so you have to change the hearts and minds of everyone. So this is part of, again, that larger convincing people why this is a good idea. And you have heroes of the story too, like this fellow, William Carney, who received the Medal of Honor for the action at Battery Wagner. So this is an important thing too, because you see that these people are doing heroic things and winning awards for it. So not only are they sharing in fighting and dying, but they're also sharing in the heroics. So again, another step toward changing the hearts and minds of people in the United States. This allows creation on May 22nd, 1863, of the United States Colored Troops. So before that point, if you were a contraband, if you were a black man in the U.S. and you wanted to enlist in the U.S. Army, you had to go through a state regiment. Some had better success than others. The creation of U.S. Colored Troops created a separate entity within the U.S. Army that allowed all these men to go into their own regiments. So you could bypass any state politics and go right into the federal army. This is another huge step in the process, because this is the federal government officially recognizing these men as a fighting force and the effectiveness of these men as soldiers in the U.S. Army. So the 180,000 men eventually enlisted in the U.S. Colored Troops, over 800 from the state of Delaware, so they could be pulled from anywhere. So Henry DuPont, who ran the DuPont Powder Yards, who was also head of the Delaware Militia, was proud of the fact that over 800 men from Delaware, who were contrabands, who were free black men from Delaware, joined up for the U.S. Colored Troops out of the state of Delaware. And where this leads us are what's called the Reconstruction Amendments. So changing the hearts and minds, you can finally force a vote in the U.S. Congress and put this before the states. So on December 6, 1865, and this is the ratification by a majority of the states, the 13th Amendment passed the U.S., or passed and became part of the Constitution. So this ended slavery in the U.S. Now later this led to the 14th Amendment, and I am summarizing these up because I know there's a lot of other bits and pieces to it, but more important for our story, what the 14th Amendment does, which ratified on July 9, 1868, was give citizenship to black people in the United States, due process under law, and equal protection under law. And then the 15th Amendment passed in 1870, which gave universal male suffrage. So black men could vote at that point, not black women, but this is an important step in the process. So these are all amendments that are able to come about because of all of these further steps, the start of the distinction of contraband of war, through the Confiscation Acts, through the Emancipation Proclamation, through serving in the military. This is all, again, part of the changing of the hearts and minds. So this leads, and I'm going to give you a bit of aftermath here. This is not necessarily a fully happy story. So you have Reconstruction of the South and the creation of what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the idea of Reconstruction is that the U.S. military was supposed to occupy all the states that were in rebellion and stay there until they rewrote their state constitutions, effectively ending slavery or any kind of resurgence of it. Anyone who was a general in the Confederate Army, a Confederate politician, couldn't hold office under the Reconstruction. That you had a lot of bits and pieces going on to prevent everything from happening that happened in 1860 that led to the war. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was an official unit of the U.S. government led by General Oliver Howard to figure out what do we do next. So now we have all of these people who are no longer slaves. What do they do? What do we do with all these people who are now citizens? So the idea was to help find them places to live, to help introduce them to U.S. government, a lot of the U.S. laws, which a lot of them were very aware of by this point, so don't think that people weren't aware of what was going on, but this was the idea of the Freedmen's Bureau, was to try to educate these folks, tell them what's going on, help them out, help them move forward. So this is an incredibly controversial thing that happens with the U.S. government, and is pushed back on by practically every state. So this poster is from the state of Pennsylvania. And let me read out a little bit of it to you in case you can't see it. It says, the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the President, then Andrew Johnson, and made law by Congress. Support Congress and you support the Negro, sustain the President and you protect the white man. So this is how people felt about things like the Freedmen's Bureau and how controversial this was. They saw that even though slavery had ended, they didn't want equal citizenship. They didn't want suffrage. They didn't want these people to be seen, or in reality by the law, be their equals in the United States. So there's a lot of pushback against the things that the Freedmen's Bureau did. And this also sets the stage for Jim Crow laws. So a fun fact to throw out to you all, the state of Delaware, though it was a slave state, never had to go under military reconstruction, because it was a state that stayed in the Union. There was no active rebellion here, although there were a lot of people in Delaware who wanted to see the state secede. So Delaware didn't have to rewrite its state constitution. People who were in power could stay in power. So one of the things that people in Delaware did after the passage of the 13th, 14th Amendments were institute things like poll taxes, literacy tests, to try to keep black people from voting. It passed the smell test in the state of Delaware. So at the end of the military reconstruction, a lot of places looked to Delaware to say, hey, if this passed in the Delaware Supreme Court, why can't it pass in ours? You know, if this is good in these states, why wouldn't it be good in ours? So you see the pattern for a lot of Jim Crow laws in the United States start right here in Delaware, which is not necessarily a happy aspect of the American Civil War, but part of the blowback against some of this war policy and some of the bigger legal wrangling that you see go on in Delaware. And by the way, the state of Delaware didn't officially ratify the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendments until 1902, whenever the state of Delaware changed hands from the then Democratic Party to the then Republican Party. Now, it didn't matter at that point because a majority of the states had ratified these amendments, but Delaware did it symbolically then. So this kind of gives you an idea of this larger pattern within the state of Delaware. But this is where I want to drop you off tonight, that there's a lot going on in the American Civil War, but it's important to remember the story of contrabands and why they're important in the bigger picture of not only changing the hearts and minds of Americans, but changing war policy, helping change the aims of the Lincoln administration to make emancipation a major war aim and make it a major part of how the U.S. government wanted to conduct the war and a lot of its aftermath. So this sets the tone for what happens later in the 19th century and well into the 20th with things like the resurgence, or like the creation of the Ku Klux Klan and then its resurgence in the 20s and 30s, but then also a lot of the race riots in America in the 1890s, passage of civil rights legislation later on, also things like Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board, but the legacy of all this goes back to the American Civil War, and Delaware is an important part of that story. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Louis. Yeah, good to have you. We have someone else in the audience, and I was wondering if anyone from that group might like to get up and just give us an update. We're very much interested in what 107C is doing in terms of, you know, if they could just give us some information about what their group is doing. David, can we have you come up here? Sonny? Lynette, come on up. Yeah, go ahead.
Is here fine?
Go right ahead. If you want to go up to the mic, that's fine. If you want to just stand down here, that's fine too.
Use the mic.
Okay.
Hi, good evening, everyone. How are you? I'm David Wilk. It's a pleasure to be back here this year. Again, Darlene and Pete, thank you very much for the invitation, and even more importantly, thank you for all the support and partnership that we've had over the years leading up to the grand opening of 107C on December 14th of 2022. So this was a major event, and we're all so excited. But the greatest excitement behind the reimagination and reopening of 107C is the blessing of having all of the former students. We had between 10 and 12 former students that went to the school that have, God blessed us with having them live long enough to walk through the doors again after the school was closed. And our inspirer-in-chief is Mr. James Sonny Knott, and one of the other blessings of our journey for our group is having the opportunity to get to know Sonny and to be able to deliver on our promise to do everything we could to get the school open and have you walk through. And there were two really key components to the project. The first component was we had to honor the history of the 1920 schoolhouse that's been on Mill Creek Road, and it was basically partially destroyed or in development, and so we had to come in and undo and redo to come to create what you all see today. How many of you have been by the properties recently? Okay, well, the first part of our message tonight is we want to invite each and every one of you and all your friends and family and anyone who's interested. We are now officially open. We don't have operating hours exactly, but my phone number is on the door of the school, and if anybody wants to come over there, I will personally take time to meet you and show you around and take whatever time is necessary. So that was number one, getting the physical structure, but the most important part of it was to take and really curate the story about what happened in the school, and Dr. Lynette Edwards was I just can't even say enough amazing things about what Dr. Edwards did to basically tell the story, work with all of the students to curate and collect all of the amazing information. So I don't want to spoil it, but you have to come by and see for yourself. It is an absolute work of wonderment. And thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. And so we've got the physical and the story, and then we also have a whole programming strategy. And the programming strategy is, and thank you so much to Lucas and to Milt for your great presentations tonight as well. They were really interesting. But our programming is all about history, retelling the history of what happened. As you heard from both of the speakers, most people in Delaware do not realize the monumental role that Hockessin and this school number 107 played in Brown v. Board of Education. And we need to make sure that everyone in Delaware knows about this and realizes how proud we should be of this moment in our state's history where, according to Dr. Edwards, Delaware was responsible in 1952, not in 1954 at Brown, for desegregating schools in our state before the rest of the country made it a law. Did I get that right, Dr. Edwards? So, and that's really important. so that's one pillar. Our second pillar is we're living in a world with a lot of polarization and a lot of people who are not tolerant of people that are different than them. And that cannot be tolerated. And that is at the core of our mission. No person in our country should ever be discriminated against for any reason. And this school should hopefully stand as a memorial to all of our efforts collectively to make sure that we change that dynamic in our society today. And so the way we're going to do that is to create workshops and gatherings and meetings and speakers, similar to what we had tonight, all about improving all of our cultural competency. Cultural competency means, how do we relate to each other? Can we sit in a room and talk to each other about controversial and contemporary social issues without spewing venom at each other? And to be able to learn from each other and empathize with each other about what it's like to feel a certain way, whether it's gender, age, race, ethnicity, whatever the disability, anything that is involved, we need to be able to do that. And we think that this 107C will become a place where we can all grow together in that regard. And then third is, because of its history and what happened there, to be able to create a place, a safe place, where people can have conversations, civil discourse about contemporary social issues that we all need to learn more about so that we can all be better neighbors to each other. And then the fourth one is, we're really being aggressive on this, trying to see if we can take the collective talent and energies of everyone in the community to figure out how do we transform society through a new concept, not new, but an innovative concept called social infrastructure. And it's solving problems around infrastructure, affordable housing, education, most importantly, healthcare, food security, public safety, social justice, open entrepreneurship, meaning everyone has an opportunity to reach their own full human potential. And to be able to do that in this sacred place. So that's kind of a snapshot of what we're trying to do, and we welcome you into that. I'd like to introduce our leader, Inspire Sunny Knott, and then I would like Dr. Edwards to just say a few words too. So thank you. We okay?
Good evening. As you were all told, my name is Sunny Knott. I'm a former student of the 107C school. When David was telling me about how we were going to refurbish the school and get it up and running and everything, I got excited, but I told them, I said, don't you be too long, because at that time I was around 90 years old, so time was running out. I spent my first year of education in Maryland, and then my parents decided to come to Delaware. They didn't discuss with me whether I wanted to come or not. They just said, get in the car, we're going. When we arrived in Delaware in 1937, I went to 107C school, a one-room school, 6 grades, and 1 teacher. I walked in, a little scared kid, but excited to be in the 107C. Our teacher was named Mrs. Bojan. People say, how did one teacher teach all you kids? But back then we had discipline. And nowadays parents go to school to discuss things. The last thing I wanted was my mother to come to school. Because if mom comes to school, I would say, Lord, if you want me to live, you better freeze her before she gets to me. Because they didn't play that. There were 6 rows of seats in this school. 1st, 2nd, 3rd to the 6th grade. We didn't have fancy computers and all this kind of stuff. I volunteered at Delcastle School. Been there for 22 years. Ever all this fancy stuff, and the kids still not learning. But anyway, we didn't have that kind. We had blackboards, and we read from a book. You stand up and read, and the teacher would say, Sonny, read page 3 and 4. Okay, I'm an intelligent guy. So I would start reading page 3. I go to turn 4, and it wouldn't be there. Why is that? Because we never got new books. We got the old books from the white school up on the hill. And back during that time, you wrote your name in the back of the book. By the time we got the book, there were 3 or 4 names in there. And the names were of all our classmates around Hockessin. We played with them every day, but we just couldn't go to the big school up on the hill. So we had to go to the 107C. And I tell people, do not forget the C. 107 is just a number, but that C identifies that school. Now, I'm not going to go any further. I could talk all night. But most of you are like me now. I think your recliner's calling you. I know my recliner's calling me. God bless you.
Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Lynette R. Edwards, and it is indeed a pleasure to be before you this evening. I want to thank Darlene Amobi and Pete Seeley for inviting me, and this is one of the rare times that I'm in the country or not traveling, right? So I was happy to be here. I really want to thank our guest speakers, especially to Lucas. Hi. He has been phenomenal. We've been working together about 3 years now. What I really wanted to stand before you to say is that when you see individual projects, when you hear the word Hockessin, know whether it says Colored Historical Society, whether it's someone from far or near, we are all in this together. And we have to take ownership of our story. To the librarian who's saying, she's not going to do this, I will do this, Suzanne Smith. Wave your hand. Suzanne, wave your hand. There you are. Suzanne and I were colleagues at Glasgow High School many years ago, and she can attest to the passion we've had about this for over 25 years. When my youngest now, who is 26, my oldest child is now 38. And this is a much needed conversation. Timing is everything. I want to share, number one, that I just finished the publication with Arcadia in the Image series. So the Hockessin 107C story will be available June 10th. Actually, you can go online now to pre-order through Barnes & Noble's, Amazon, Target. It's in multiple markets, but we will have that available, and we will be releasing that book so that you can understand what we are talking about. The book actually goes back to the colored community having 150 years in this community. That is something to be proud of. And not enough people know the story of the colored community and the 107C. Just a really quick note, the 107 was a number. There was another school when they decided to do the renumbering of the system. The 107 is in Smyrna. And so people will say, why do you say Hockessin Color School and 107C? Isn't the C for colored? Mr. Sonny said, Lynette, do not remove that C. Just tell them the story. So the 107C was to let you know it wasn't the 107 all-white school. It was the 107 that was the colored school. The Hockessin Colored School was to let you know that it was not the Hockessin school up the road, but it was the Hockessin school that was for the colored children. So when you're learning and teaching, make sure that we are really good students of history. Make sure that we are giving accuracy in what we are sharing. So I invite all of you all. We worked many years to get the displays there. It is the Beulah story, not just about Shirley Beulah, but the entire Beulah story. And the Chief Beulah is 99 years young, will be 100 years on July 18th. And Miss Hilda will let you know that everyone needs to know her family story. And so we are so thankful to be before you, and we look forward to receiving you into the 107 and doing more partnerships like this. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for inviting us out this evening.
Do we have any questions for our speakers? Anything you'd like to know, or a little clarification? Just raise your hand. Okay, we have one additional historian here, and I just want to ask if he would like to say anything about what was said today, and I'm talking about Chris Dinsmore. Would you like to stand up, Chris? Is there anything you'd like to say about what was said today?
Well, I think, in looking at the things that various different groups have been doing around here, the Canada Underground Railroad Center is now celebrating its 25th anniversary. During that past 25, 30 years, there have been so much good research coming out. A lot of it very locally based, some of it, academic. But it's amazing. I think I've got about 20 books on the list, all about this rural area, this other Chester County, going over to Delaware, and there's still lots of stuff we need to know yet. We're not very good on making that transition from Wilmington, all the stuff's going on in Wilmington, then it's going down to Philadelphia. There's a lot of stuff in between. There's a lot of room for doing stuff. And I was so pleased that Bill, chose this as a topic. He's got a great story of us putting into each other at the local historical society and saying, my goodness, that's the same story you got that I got. Let's put them together and see what happens. And what is more about this defense.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Oh, that's my partner, Pete. Do we have any questions from the audience for anything before we close? Okay, then maybe we will see you next summer for our 4th annual.